Hello, and thanks for joining us for this month's edition of The Scope of Things, a no-nonsense look at the realities and enigmas of clinical research, based on those closest to the action who aim for great and, if need be, are willing to shake things up. I'm Deborah Borfitz, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News. In today's episode, I will be speaking with Dr. Sue Golder, Associate Professor in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York, who specializes in improving the reporting of adverse events in clinical research, which she says may need a major redo. Dr. Golder, thanks for joining me on the show today to discuss this important topic.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Now, as most of our listeners likely already know, adverse event reporting is vital for determining the safety of clinical trials. But multiple studies have shown that underreporting is a problem, and efforts to improve the situation haven't accomplished much. To complicate matters further, as you point out to me during a 2021 interview, even consistent inclusion of this information in published studies doesn't necessarily provide a balanced picture of the potential harms of a therapeutic intervention. Now, before we dig into the particulars of your work in this arena, let's set the stage here. How big is the problem of underreporting, and, as we can talk about in a minute, misleading reporting about adverse events? And has this situation always existed, or is this a somewhat new development?
Yep. Well, certainly underreporting has always existed, and it still exists today, unfortunately. It's underreporting in all types of studies. So from the from the post-marketing stage onwards, we've got the regulatory data, which suffers from underreporting. A lot of people don't know what the yellow card system is in the UK, where you can report to the MHRA, which is our regulatory authority, mm-hmm. And in America, that lots of people don't realize that they can report to the FDA, for example. This has been opened up. It used to be just clinicians and healthcare professionals that could report, and because of the really bad reporting, poor reporting more so, in that a lot of healthcare professionals never reported a single adverse event. They've opened it up to the public. However, it's still very poor reporting, with very few members of the public even having heard of the system. So at that level, there's underreporting, but there's also underreporting in the observational studies that are undertaken, and in the clinical trials that are undertaken. Mostly because they have to be published in a journal article. That's the system we have currently at present. We have this system where researchers are encouraged to publish as many journal articles as they can.
Yep.
And there's really strict word limits in those journal articles. And for an RCT, for example, you might be looking for one benefit, or maybe one or two beneficial outcomes, but there are hundreds of adverse events that can occur. And when you're restricted by word limit, the first thing to go is often the adverse events or harms. So that is a major problem, in that we're not getting that data out there. So and the other problem obviously is that the harms, they're less common, so that's another reason why they're underreported in the publications, and they're often not the primary aim of the study. The study is often the beneficial effects is the primary aim, with the adverse events as a secondary aim. So yes, it is a real issue. I was much more positive last time I spoke to you, I'm afraid. And I did feel that things were improving.
Good.
Standards of reporting in journal articles is improving overall. If you read a paper from, say, 2022, it's often much clearer and well written than one, say, from the 90s or 80s, say. And that's for all studies. The reporting is just getting so much better for all studies in all subject areas, I think. However, I do think that's stagnating somewhat, and it's still got so much more room for improvement. We do have guidelines to help in the reporting. So if somebody's reporting a systematic review, for example, there's the PRISMA guidelines, which is the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And there's a harms one, which I've been involved in, where we specifically say what you should be reporting if you've done a systematic review that includes harms data. And then for trials, there's the consort statement, which is consolidated standards for reporting trials. And again, there's a consort harms, as we've been really pushing the agenda that harms need to be reported. So, and they need to be reported in a consistent and easy to read manner, and people can be able to find them. So, so that there has been those improvements. But when we did a study, came out about a year ago. We looked at how many journal articles actually comply with these reporting standards. And for consort harms, which is for the clinical trials, we found it's around half. It's not good, is it?
No.
So whilst there've been, yes, there have been small improvements, the fact remains that there's still, it's still very disappointing to see that harms aren't included more in the journal articles, particularly as we're more fortunate now. Almost every article's electronic, so you do have more room in the supplementary material, or at least, even though I don't like that because it's then a bit buried, but that's better than nothing. So, but it's easier than if we had the paper copies.
Yeah, for sure.
So yes, underreporting still a major issue across the board. So I'm not singling out any one particular research study.
Okay, very good. Okay, so let's now pivot to where you fit into this mess. Okay, as I recall, you spend a lot of time reviewing information about the adverse effects of treatments in the aggregate. And in more recent years, by perusing unpublished data in social media and text mining using natural language processing, all the latest and greatest tools and tricks. This has revealed some pretty interesting findings that suggest reported adverse events can have very little relevance to those that might happen in the real world. So tell us about that. What have been some of the biggest surprises of this investigative work?
Yeah, so it's, strictly speaking, RCTs should be the best and the highest quality data, because they're prospectively collected, they have a control arm to establish causality, and we should be making better use of them. And but they have so many problems. They're underpowered to detect adverse events because they're powered for beneficial effects, so they don't need to be as big, so they can rarely obtain statistical significance. They're really expensive to undertake. And they're often not long enough follow-up. They often don't include the people more susceptible to adverse events, frail elderly, pregnant people with comorbidities, hard to reach groups, and they're not as pragmatic. So we have been looking at other types of data. And so we have even been looking at as far as social media and unpublished sources and observational studies. And we're finding when we compare them to trials, the adverse events that trials tend to include or concentrate, at least in their published form, is the very serious. So death, maybe heart attack type thing. Yet when you look on social media, you gain the patient's perspective. You find that what people are talking about is things like muscle pain and persistent cough, etc. Whereas and there's this dismissal that they're not important. Yet when you look on social media, you see a lot of people saying, I've stopped taking my statins because they cause muscle pain, or I've stopped taking my beta blockers because I can't be putting up with this persistent cough. It's just the quality of my life has gone down so much. So that there's a real mismatch there. And I think we need an interplay of all the different data sources because they've all got their strengths and limitations. I'm not suggesting we use social media as a one-stop shop by any means. we need the high quality data from the RCTs, but then again, the RCTs can't provide us with everything we need because they can look for the short-term common adverse events that occur in relatively healthy populations.
Right.
So it's a real conundrum there, but we're not looking at all these different data sources. It's a lot of effort, it's a lot of time, and it's very hard to put them all together and get the strengths from each of the sources, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I do, absolutely. You mentioned to me previously that adverse events reporting is fairly arbitrary in terms of how often a side effect has to happen to be deemed serious or significant, and what harms researchers subjectively consider tolerable, and the variable ways that results get presented in a published study, as you talked about. I found it especially amusing that you found one drug trial reporting that few patients experienced erectile dysfunction, but the denominator included women. So is this level of game playing high? And do you think this is happening deliberately, or is the problem more one of innocent mistakes and lack of education?
I think there's a mixture of reasons that we could hypothesize that why this is happening, but it is definitely happening. That there does tend to be this emphasis, and it hasn't changed, even though we've been calling for it to change for at least a decade now, and that we have these arbitrary thresholds. Say, oh, we're only going to report adverse events that occur in more than 5% of cases. Well, then it depends on the definition of the adverse event, because you could split or lump adverse events together. So, for example, if you looked at all cancers, that would be bigger than if you looked at them separately. So you looked at breast cancer and prostate cancer, etc., separately. So arbitrary thresholds aren't good, and they also, we've got this lumping and splitting at the same time, which is tricky as well. And then there's often reporting of no significant adverse events were found. The intervention was well tolerated. It had a good safety profile. These don't really tell us what we need to know. We need much more detail. That doesn't really help. In whose opinion is subject? It's subjective. We need objective. We need data, and we need to be transparent. So we also need core harms outcomes so that we know what we're going to present on at the beginning of our research. So core outcome sets, just like we have for benefits, we could have for harms. So that we know which ones we need to say about. And it's not just the serious adverse events that are and the pre-specified that we need to know about, because pre-specified are the expected. We need to know about the unexpected ones. That, we were all surprised with the COVID vaccine, what the adverse events were. I mean, we all expected injection site pain, a little bit of a numb arm. We expected that, but some of the others we probably didn't expect. And we need to know the ones that lead to discontinuation or people refusing to take up an intervention. So we don't want people to just look for the serious or just look for the ones that cause hospitalization and death, for example.
Very logical.
Yeah, I admit though that it can feel very overwhelming as a researcher when you're looking at an intervention and you've got to look for all these harms. But that's what the decision makers need to make their decisions, including the patients, the clinicians, and the policymakers, and NICE, etc.
Yeah.
So there has been improvements, but they tend to be people using supplementary material or links to unpublished data that don't always work. Because time links don't work forever, do they?
Right.
And although that's burying it a little bit, it's better than not reporting it at all. So there has been that, but I'm afraid I feel like I'm still saying the same things that I were saying quite a few years ago. I don't think things have improved, particularly recently. That there was maybe things started to improve, and I think it's waned somewhat.
Hmm.
So I'd really like to kick it off again, in that we need to be reporting harms.
Yeah. So, what actions have regulatory authorities taken in Europe, in the U.S., and elsewhere on this front? Aren't there penalties for non-compliance? Is there anything you can point to that has affected positive change?
Well, we did have the call for clinical study reports to be available. And that this was a really positive mood. We had the open trials initiative, and that there was lots of emphasis. Yes, we're going to make it so that drug companies provide the reports, their reports of their clinical trials that they've undertaken, and these documents can be really, really detailed. They can be thousands of pages long, and there was a call for that, and it was going quite well. Then we had COVID,
Oh, yeah.
Yes, you remember that.
Oh, yeah. Top of mind.
Yeah. So everything was, all the resources were put towards COVID. There was this stagnation of this. It was seen that it was okay for them to for their concentration to be on COVID than to be on making CSRs available. They are more available than they were, but it seems again to stagnated. So they should be mostly available through Health Canada and the EMA for Europe. But there's still so many obstacles to getting this data. It's just enormous. And and without this data, if we just look at the journal article, which is like 2,000-3,000 words, it's not going to have all the data on the harms, on the adverse events. So we really need to get hold of these large, detailed reports. So I've recently been involved with one with a systematic review where we were looking for the adverse events of the HPV vaccine, and this was with Cochrane. And we wanted to know all the adverse events. We were trying to do a really thorough, good job. It was a Cochrane review. It needs to be good.
Right.
So, and we started writing to the EMA in October 2021. And as of today, we've only got around 50% of the CSRs. So it's really, really poor. And this is partly that they're just outstanding, but also there's the limitation that we can only request 2 reports at any one time, and only a maximum of 5 requests per application. So
talk about roadblocks, right?
Yeah, and even when you get the data, some of it can be retracted. So you get sheets of black, basically.
Oh my.
So it's a real problem, and it's taken a lot of effort to try and get even just half the CSRs. And there's constant pressure, particularly as time goes on, the pressure is getting greater for researchers to amalgamate all this data quicker, faster, and more efficiently. Yet you can have potentially hundreds of harms or adverse events for even just one intervention, and you need to do very detailed analysis to work out whether there's causality. It can be really tricky whether it's but the patient's got it for another reason, or whether it's caused by the intervention. And yet our time is being spent on administrative stuff of trying to get these CSRs, and we're still not getting enough of them. Over a year later, we've only got half of them. So this is a real bug to bear. And I know that they stopped making them available because of COVID, but there's only so long you can use the excuse of COVID. We really need to push for them. And bearing in mind, as a researcher myself, it's really difficult because I've got this conundrum. I really want to investigate all these adverse events properly, seriously, and to be careful, very mindful of what I'm going to say, because of what could be caused, because it can, what can have a causal link, because it can have really big implications if it stops people taking the medication, if they're frightened of an adverse event. So you've got to be really careful and you do the research to the best of your ability, but without all the data, it's really hard, and you're under this pressure of time. I mean, so I say that was for a Cochrane review, which we do, can take a year or more to undertake, but lots of reviews are taken in lots of different countries for their governments, and they don't have that time period. So they'll have even less than half of the CSRs. So a real problem there, I think.
Yeah, and I want to go back just for a minute to maybe the patient perspective a bit more. When you look at information sources about drug-related adverse events outside of what is being reported in randomized controlled trials, what have you been learning? I know you mentioned a few examples already, but in general, what are you learning in terms of the side effects patients themselves care about the most?
Well, it depends on what the medication's for, but lots of medications are there to prevent something happening to you, like statins or beta blockers. They're there to prevent you or to control your blood pressure, to control your cholesterol, or to reduce your risk of stroke. So often the patients are healthy, and so they're taking something that is there to prevent something that might happen, and that their threshold would be lower than, for example, somebody taking a medication to get rid of a symptom. Just, I mean, so it does vary depending on the type of medication it is. But I do get the feeling from what I've been reading on particularly on social media, is that patients don't feel listened to when they have a persistent cough or muscle ache or tiredness or erectile dysfunction or a loss of libido or weight gain, because they're not something that cause hospitalization. They're not something that cause death or disability, which is what clinicians tend to be more focused on. Obviously, they're all important. Not obviously. So it really depends on the type of medication that you're taking, what it's for. I think what the patient's perspective is. So, obviously chemotherapy has a lot of dreadful side effects, but obviously the beneficial effects can be enormous as well. So it really has to be on a case-by-case basis that the benefits and harms need to be considered. But you need to think about them all, because they all have different different impacts on the patient. But if something stops a patient taking something, then it doesn't matter how effective it is.
Exactly.
So it's the most important thing, whether they're happy to continue their medication.
Got it. And I also want to toggle back to, because you've mentioned the Cochrane reports a few times now, and the point of these large scale adverse event reviews that you have made your life work basically is to pick up on the overlooked safety signals and enable robust subgroup analysis based on patient characteristics like age and sex. And this work happens through your involvement with the Cochrane Adverse Effects Methods Group, which listeners may not be familiar with. So can you fill us in a little bit more on the group's sort of overarching role and purpose?
Yeah. So the Cochrane was born, so to speak, in the early 1990s, and it focused on randomized controlled trials, and it focused on the benefits, mostly in obs and gynae. And it's grown, it's international, it's a massive organization, high quality standards, and it's grown to do much more than obs and gynae, much more than just the effectiveness. It's now looking at the harms or the adverse events and trying to give a complete picture when it does systematic reviews. That's not to say a lot of the systematic reviews on Cochrane will still look at just the benefits, but then again, some will just look at the harms. But our group, we got together in 2007 because we saw that there weren't enough reviews on harms or enough reviews that discuss the benefits and harms at the same time. And that's what we've been campaigning for since 2007, to get more harms included in systematic reviews, not just Cochrane reviews, but all reviews, because it's really important that people make a balanced decision looking at the benefits and harms. All interventions can cause that can have an effect, can have a harmful effect potentially. So harms are really important to look at, and that's our message really. And we've had successes, although I think it's, as I say, I think it's slowing down our rate of success, shall we say?
Yeah. We were at the height of the pandemic when we spoke last, and public discourse about COVID-19 vaccines was sometimes putting too much emphasis on adverse events, as you had pointed out, and not enough on the potential benefits. So this seems to have settled out quite a bit, but it points to the importance of being even-handed in assessing the risk-benefits trade-off. Do you think the pandemic in any way permanently helped or hurt the way that calculation gets made and reported moving forward?
I think the pandemic, unfortunately, has had lots of repercussions, which we still haven't recovered from. Overall, not just with adverse events, but overall, I think the pandemic, during the pandemic, scientists lost a lot of trust from the public. I think scientists were often seen as a scapegoat for government policy, and it was not our role as a scientist to tell the government what to do. It was more of ours to present them with the facts, and we had to use modelling, which is one of the worst, perhaps unreliable study design, because that's all that we could do under the circumstances. And lots of people, I think, came out of the woodwork that were less mainstream scientists, that people were saying what people wanted to hear, and they got as much or disproportionately were disproportionately vocal on social media and got more attention than maybe they should have on the news, because that they were saying what people wanted to hear, and people were getting the wrong idea that there was, that scientists were split. Obviously, scientists, we don't always agree on everything, and that's part of what makes it interesting. But sometimes what the mainstream scientists feel wasn't getting through, I think, enough. So yes, so it has changed, and it also became clear from what politicians were saying that they didn't always understand science, and they didn't always understand risk and statistics. That's come through quite a lot from the pandemic, which they're not scientists. Is fair enough. That but it's really important that they do understand in such a circumstance as a pandemic. And the poor presentation of statistics. I mean, we've all heard that statistics can lie, and the media reporting and what have you. I think it really lacked public trust and people's understanding of statistics and risk. So the vaccine was always going to have adverse events. There's no such thing as something a vaccine that doesn't have some adverse events. I mean, it just always is, and it's getting the public to accept that. They've accepted that when they cross the road, they might get run over, but they still cross the road.
Right.
It's not to say that we should over think about the risks, because we shouldn't overthink about them, but we should be aware of them and know about them. And yeah, the public trust was lost somewhat. I think a good example was the pregnant women and the confusion about whether at the beginning whether they should have the COVID vaccine or not.
Oh, yes.
And there was lots of reports saying that they shouldn't. And then there was lots of reports saying that, well, actually, that they should be prioritized and they should be having it first. And I think it became very confusing to patients. Even healthcare professionals, I think, were confused to some degree. We actually looked at why pregnant women or pregnant people were less likely to accept the vaccine, and we actually looked at social media, thousands and thousands of posts about people saying why it was, and they were really confused about the safety, whether it was safe or not. They were scared. They resented being called anti-vax or even vaccine hesitant, because that's not how they felt themselves to be. They felt themselves to be in this turmoil of not knowing who to trust and what to do, basically.
Yep.
And it was really unfair. What was happening to them. You really felt for them when you read their stories, about that difficult decision to make, not just for themselves but their unborn child. Really, really tricky. With all the confused messages, and it's understandable why the messages came out. We didn't have enough data at the beginning, and then we did have enough data, so we were being cautious. But I don't think that's necessarily how it's communicated. It wasn't communicated very well at all. So yeah, that lack of trust and people wanting to do their own research does concern me going forward. So lots of things concern me.
Yes, my goodness. It sounds like you have your work cut out for you, Dr. Golder. Oh my, we're going to need to stay in touch to see how this all plays out through this next election cycle and beyond. But for today, we've come to the end of our time together. I so appreciate all you do to help keep scientific evidence trustworthy and enable people and the doctors who support them to make balanced decisions about their health and ultimately create an environment for keeping clinical trials as safe as they could possibly be. Thanks for agreeing to be on the show, and keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you very much.
As always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. For more straight talk on studies involving humans, visit clinicalresearchnewsonline.com. And if you're a clinical research professional, we hope also to see you at our next SCOPE conference, where we make things happen. Bye for now.